What if the most shameful chapter of your life is actually the most sacred one? What if the thing that has broken you, humiliated you, cost you everything you loved, is not a punishment from God, but a message written specifically for you in a language only your soul was built to read? Carl Jung spent decades inside the darkest rooms of the human psyche. He sat with the addicted, the broken, the people society had written off as lost causes. And what he found did not match what the world said about them. The world said they were weak. Jung said they were searching. The world said they were sinners. Jung said they were pilgrims. The world said their addiction was a disease of the body or a failure of character. Jung said it was a spiritual crisis wearing a psychological mask. And more than that, he said it was a call, a divine summons, a message from the deepest layer of the soul addressed to people who were meant to awaken but had not yet found the door. This is not a comfortable idea. It will not sit well with those who prefer their spirituality clean and their psychology tidy. But Jung never offered comfort. He offered truth. And the truth he discovered about addiction, about what it means, where it comes from, and why certain people cannot escape it, no matter how hard they try, is one of the most profound and least understood revelations in the history of the human mind. You were not chosen for an easy path. You were chosen for a real one. The letter you were never taught to read Jung believed that every human being carries within them what he called the self. Not the small surface self that goes to work and pays bills and smiles in photographs, but the vast, unknowable, divine self that contains everything you have ever been and everything you were meant to become. He described it as the God within, the center around which the whole personality is meant to organize, the still point inside the storm. Most people never encounter this self directly. They live their entire lives on the surface, navigating the social world, wearing their personas like armor, and never asking the deeper question of who they truly are beneath all the roles they have been assigned. And most people, Jung noted with a certain sadness, are never forced to ask that question. They live comfortably in the shallows and die there, never having known the depths. But then there are others. There are people for whom the surface simply refuses to hold, people for whom ordinary life, no matter how well constructed, carries a persistent wrongness, a dull ache that nothing seems to touch, a hunger that the ordinary world cannot satisfy. These are the people who find themselves at the edge of addiction, not because they are weaker than everyone else, but because something in them is reaching for something that normal life has failed to provide, something that cannot be named but cannot be ignored, something that drives them back again and again to the substance, the behavior, the escape, not because they enjoy the destruction, but because for one moment, sometimes just one moment, they feel it. They feel alive. They feel connected. They feel like themselves in a way that ordinary waking life never allows. Jung recognized this pattern with startling clarity. He wrote about it in a letter that has since become one of the most quoted documents in addiction psychology. His letter to Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. In that letter, Jung said something that should have changed the way we understand addiction forever. He said that the craving for alcohol, at its deepest level, is the craving for wholeness, for transcendence, for God. He used the Latin words spiritus contra spiritum, spirit against spirit, the spirit in the bottle against the spirit in the soul, two forces that use the same word because they are, at some profound and terrible level, reaching for the same thing. This is the letter your addiction has been writing to you. A letter in a language you were never taught to read. Not the language of weakness or sin or moral failure, but the language of longing. The language of a soul that knows, even when the mind does not, that it was made for something more than what this world has offered it. The God-shaped wound. Before we go further, we need to understand something about the kind of people who fall into addiction the way you did. Not the people who try something recreationally and develop a habit. not the people who drink socially and one day cross a line. Those patterns exist, and they have their own stories. But the pattern we are speaking of here is different. It is the pattern of the person for whom the first encounter with the substance or the behavior felt like coming home, like remembering something, like finally, after years of inexplicable emptiness, finding the thing that made the noise in their chest go quiet. Jung understood this moment. He understood that what these people were experiencing was not simply the pharmacological effect of a chemical. It was the first time they had touched, however briefly and however destructively, something that felt like the numinous. A word Jung used frequently, numinous, meaning the overwhelming, awe-inspiring, terrifying sense of contact with the sacred, with something larger than the self, with the divine. The tragedy is that they found it in the wrong place, or perhaps more accurately, they found a counterfeit of it in a place that could not sustain it. Because the numinous cannot be manufactured by substances. It cannot be stored in a bottle or dissolved in a powder or summoned on demand. The moment of transcendence passes, and what remains is the memory of it, a memory so vivid, so longed for, that the entire architecture of a life can collapse in the attempt to recapture it. But here is what Jung would want you to hear. The fact that you had that experience at all is significant. The fact that your soul reached for transcendence, that it knew there was something more, that it refused to be sedated by the pale substitutes everyone else seemed satisfied with. This is not a flaw. It is a faculty, a spiritual faculty that most people never develop because they never needed to, because their wounds were not deep enough, their hunger was not fierce enough, their soul was not awake enough to demand what yours demanded. You carry what Jung would call a God-shaped wound, a place inside you where ordinary human experience cannot reach, where ordinary comfort cannot land, where ordinary meaning cannot stick. And nothing about this wound is random. Everything about it is purposeful. It was placed there not to punish you, but to orient you, to ensure that you could never be satisfied with less than what you were actually built for. The wound is the compass. The addiction is what happens when you try to fill it with something that was never meant to fit. The shadow knows your name. To understand why Jung saw addiction as spiritually significant, you have to understand his concept of the shadow. Jung taught that from the moment we are born, we begin sorting our experience. We learn what is acceptable and what is not, what earns us love and what earns us rejection, what parts of ourselves are welcome in the world and what parts must be hidden, suppressed, locked away in the basement of the personality. The good child, the quiet child, the strong child, the obedient child. Whatever mask was required, we learned to wear it. And everything that did not fit beneath that mask, the rage, the grief, the desire, the fear, the wildness, the hunger, went somewhere else. It went into the shadow. The shadow is not evil. Jung was precise about this. The shadow is not the monster that lives beneath the surface. It is simply everything you decided you could not afford to be. Everything you were taught was too much, too dark, too strange, too needy, too angry, too broken to be acceptable. And so you buried it. And it waited. Here is what happens when the shadow is denied long enough. It stops waiting patiently and begins to insist. It begins to leak out around the edges of the carefully constructed personality. It begins to undermine, to sabotage, to erupt in ways that embarrass and confuse the conscious self. It finds back doors, and one of the most effective back doors it can find is addiction, because addiction dismantles the persona. It tears away the constructed self and exposes everything underneath. Every addiction that consumes someone is a shadow event, a massive, unignorable uprising of the denied self, forcing everything that was buried to the surface where it can no longer be ignored. The rages, the shames, the needs, the truths that were too dangerous to speak, they all come flooding out through the crack that addiction opens in the wall. This is why people who have lived most of their lives as responsible, controlled, even admirable human beings sometimes collapse into addiction in ways that shock everyone who knows them. It is not a sudden emergence of weakness. It is the return of everything that was sacrificed for the performance of strength. The shadow does not forget what it was given, and it does not disappear because you ignore it. It grows. And when it finally moves, it moves like an underground river that has finally found an outlet, with the force of everything that was held back and with the direction of everything that was denied. Jung would say, your addiction is not destroying the real you. It is destroying the false you. It is demolishing the persona, the mask, that you built to protect yourself from a world that could not handle the full truth of who you are. And yes, this demolition is painful. Yes, it is catastrophic in many ways. Yes, it costs things that should never have had to be paid. But underneath the devastation is something Jung considered more valuable than anything the persona was protecting: the possibility of encountering your actual self for the first time. This is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the most important process a human being can undertake, the process of becoming whole. The descent that was always the ascent. Every mythological tradition in human history contains the same story: a hero, a descent into darkness, a confrontation with something that cannot be avoided, a death, a return, transformed. Orpheus descending into the underworld, Jonah inside the whale, Christ in the tomb, Persephone in the realm of shadows. The hero of 1,000 faces, as Joseph Campbell, deeply influenced by Jung, would later call it, always follows the same arc: down before up, darkness before light, death before resurrection, and never, in any version of the story, is the descent optional. The hero is always dragged down, always forced, always taken somewhere they would not have chosen to go. Jung understood that psychological transformation follows the same pattern. You cannot ascend to your fullest self by remaining on the surface. You cannot become whole by only inhabiting the comfortable parts of your personality. The descent into the shadow, into the underworld of the unconscious, is not a detour from the journey of becoming. It is the journey. There is no other way through. Your addiction has been dragging you down. This is undeniable. But Jung would ask you to consider the possibility that the direction was never wrong, only the vehicle. The descent into the unconscious, into the shadow, into the raw material of who you are beneath all the layers of conditioning and performance. This was necessary. It was always necessary. The question is whether you can begin to make it conscious, whether you can begin to walk into the darkness with your eyes open instead of being dragged there blind. Because the person who is dragged into the underworld unconsciously through addiction experiences only the destruction. They cannot see the gifts buried in the dark because they cannot see anything at all. But the person who begins to descend consciously, who begins to sit with their shadow instead of fighting it, who begins to ask what the compulsion is really reaching for, who begins to listen to the language their soul has been speaking all along, this person begins to find something extraordinary in the wreckage. They begin to find themselves. Not the self that was constructed for the world's approval. Not the self that played the roles and wore the masks and performed the identity that kept people at a comfortable distance from the truth. The real self. The whole self. The self that includes the darkness and the light, the wound and the wisdom, the failure and the grace. What Carl Jung said about the alcoholic, that nobody talks about. When Bill Wilson received Jung's letter in 1961, he was moved to tears. And well, he should have been. Because what Jung said in that letter was not what anyone else was saying about alcoholics at the time, or in most cases, what anyone is saying about addicts now. Jung said that the alcoholic's craving is a low-level equivalent of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness. He said that the cause of the problem was the spiritual need that could not be met by any material or psychological solution. He said that the only cure that could reach this depth was a genuine spiritual experience, a real encounter with the numinous, with the sacred, with the divine. That was powerful enough to displace the compulsion at the level where the compulsion actually lived. This was a revolutionary statement, not because it romanticized addiction. Jung was not naive about the destruction it caused, but because it took seriously what the addict themselves knew but could never articulate, that what they were looking for was real, that the hunger was real, that the sense that there was something more, something their ordinary life had failed to give them, was not a delusion or a symptom. It was a perception that was leading them astray in method, but was essentially correct in direction. God is real. The sacred is real. The hunger for transcendence that pulses at the center of the most self-destructive life you have ever witnessed is a real hunger, pointed at a real destination. The tragedy is not that the person was wrong to want what they wanted. The tragedy is that they were looking for it in a place that could only ever give them a shadow of it, beautiful enough to keep them searching, hollow enough to ensure they never found it there. Jung believed and said explicitly that no treatment that does not address this spiritual dimension can reach the root of addiction. You can manage the symptoms. You can remove the substance. You can teach coping skills and build support systems and prescribe medications. And all of these things matter. All of these things can save lives, but they do not touch the wound that the addiction was responding to. And if that wound remains untouched, the hunger remains alive. And a hunger that cannot be satisfied will always, eventually, find a way to feed. This is not pessimism. This is the most hopeful thing you will read today, because it means the cure exists. It means the wound can be transformed. It means the hunger, when finally directed toward its true source, can actually be satisfied, not numbed, not managed, satisfied. The wounded healer. There is an archetype that Jung wrote about with particular depth and tenderness. He called it the wounded healer. The image comes from Greek mythology. Chiron, the centaur who was teacher to the greatest heroes of his age, Achilles, Asclepius, Jason, Heracles, was himself incurably wounded. Struck by a poisoned arrow, he lived with a wound that could not be healed. And it was precisely this wound, this living acquaintance with suffering, that made him capable of teaching others to face their own. Jung identified this archetype as one of the most important in the psychology of the healer, the therapist, the guide, the spiritual teacher, the person who has been to the bottom, who has lived inside the darkness, who carries a wound that has never fully closed. This person, he said, possesses a gift that no amount of education or training can manufacture. They possess what he called the knowledge of the depths. They know what it is to be broken open. They know what it is to lose everything and still be breathing. They know what it is to look for God in the bottom of a bottle and find only more thirst. They know what it is to wake up in the morning with shame so heavy it feels like a physical weight on the chest. And they know, with a certainty that cannot be argued away, that there is something on the other side of that darkness. Because they have been there, because they survived it, because the descent, as devastating as it was, did not kill them, and something in that fact is not accidental. The person who has traveled through addiction and begun to emerge on the other side carries a wisdom that cannot be learned from books or acquired in classrooms. They carry the map of a territory that most people will never visit, and the people who are still in that territory, still lost in the darkness of their compulsion, still convinced they are beyond help, still certain that no one could possibly understand what it is like to be them. Those people need someone who has been there, not someone who read about it, someone who lived it. This is part of what Jung meant when he spoke about the purposefulness of the wound, the sacred wound, the wound that will not heal, the addiction that unmade a life. It is not only a personal catastrophe, it is a preparation. It is training in the most difficult and necessary kind of human understanding, and the person who undergoes it and survives it and begins to understand it is not diminished by the experience. They are equipped by it, marked by it, made capable by it, of a kind of service that the unwounded simply cannot offer. You were not broken by accident. You were broken open for a reason. The individuation. That only suffering can complete, Jung believed that the central task of human life was individuation, the process of becoming a fully realized individual, a whole person who has integrated all parts of themselves, including the parts that were denied, and the parts that were terrifying, and the parts that society said could not exist. He believed that this process was difficult for everyone, but impossible for some without being forced. That certain people, because of the depth of their disconnection from themselves, because of the height of the walls they had built, because of the thickness of the persona they had constructed, certain people would never begin the work of individuation unless something outside their conscious control forced them to, broke through the walls, reached past the persona, dragged them, screaming if necessary, into the encounter with themselves. He saw addiction as one of these forcing functions. As brutal and destructive and costly as it was, it accomplished what decades of ordinary living had failed to accomplish. It took a person who had been successfully avoiding themselves for years, sometimes decades, and made that avoidance impossible. It stripped away the social identity, the professional success, the comfortable story, the manageable emotions, and left the person standing in the ruins of everything they had used to keep themselves at a safe distance from their own soul. This is not romantic. It is not pleasant. But Jung understood it as ultimately purposeful. The individuation that happens after addiction, the encounter with the shadow, the integration of the denied self, the confrontation with the wound, the search for genuine spiritual experience. This is a more complete and more radical individuation than most people ever achieve, because most people never have their defenses dismantled forcibly enough to require it. The person who has been through the fire of addiction and survived it and done the work of understanding it, this person has access to a wholeness, a depth, a genuinely integrated self that the person who never descended into the darkness may never know. Not because suffering is inherently good, but because in the depths of their suffering, they were forced to meet parts of themselves that the rest of the world is still successfully hiding from. The alchemists whom Jung studied obsessively had a phrase for this: nigredo, the blackening, the stage of the great work in which all the base material is burned, decomposed, reduced to its essential elements, made unrecognizable, and apparently ruined. The alchemists understood that nothing could be transformed without first being broken down, that the gold could not be extracted from the ore without the fire, that the nigredo was not the end of the process, but the necessary beginning of it, that what looked like destruction from the outside was, from a different vantage point, preparation. Your nigredo has been thorough, your fire has been real. And what the fire burns away is not the soul. It is everything that was not the soul, everything that was constructed and performed and maintained at enormous cost. And what remains, when the fire has done its work, is something that cannot be burned, something that was always there beneath all the layers, something that the addiction, in its terrible and backhanded way, has been trying to reach all along. The real conversation. Jung wrote that the unconscious communicates with the conscious mind through symbols, images, dreams, and symptoms. When the unconscious cannot reach us through the gentler channels, through dreams we dismiss, through intuitions we override, through the small, persistent voice we tell ourselves is just anxiety, it resorts to symptoms, physical symptoms, psychological symptoms, relational symptoms, and addictive symptoms. Your addiction is a symptom. Not of weakness, not of moral failure, not of a broken brain, though the brain is involved. It is a symptom of a conversation that has been trying to happen between the depths of your soul and the surface of your life, a conversation that the surface refused to allow, and so the depths found another way to make themselves heard. The question that changes everything is this: are you willing to listen now? Not to the addiction itself, not to the craving or the compulsion or the part of you that reaches for the substance, but to what lies underneath it, to the wound the craving is protecting, to the hunger the behavior is trying to feed, to the part of you that knew long before the addiction ever started that something was missing, something essential, something sacred, something that this world, for all its offerings, had never provided. Jung did not believe the answer to addiction was found in willpower or discipline or the determination to simply stop. He believed it was found in the radical willingness to turn toward the self, toward the whole self, including everything that has been denied, and to begin the slow, difficult, magnificent work of integration, of wholeness, of becoming, for the first time, actually and completely yourself. This work is not quick. It is not comfortable. It asks things of you that you may not be sure you have to give. But it is the only work that reaches the place where the addiction lives, the only medicine that can address the wound that the addiction was answering, the only journey that leads not just away from the destruction, but towards something real and whole and alive. The moment the language changes. There is a moment in every genuine recovery, not the managed recovery, not the white-knuckled sobriety, but the real thing, the transformation that Jung was describing, when the language changes, when the person stops saying, "I am fighting my addiction," and starts saying, "I am listening to myself," when they stop treating the compulsion as an enemy to be defeated and start treating it as a message to be decoded, when they stop being ashamed of what the addiction revealed and start being curious about it. This is the moment Jung was pointing toward. This is when individuation actually begins, when the shadow is no longer the enemy, but the guide, when the wound is no longer the evidence of your failure, but the source of your depth, when the hunger that drove you to the lowest points of your life becomes the same hunger, now finally rightly directed, that pulls you toward the highest thing you are capable of becoming. Jung believed, and the evidence of countless lives bears this out, that the person who has done this work is not simply a recovered addict. They are a fundamentally different kind of human being than they were before. Not better in the sense of more virtuous or more disciplined, better in the sense of more complete, more real, more integrated, more capable of sitting with the full range of human experience, their own and other, without flinching from the darkness. They become, in the truest sense of the word, a healer, not necessarily in the professional sense, though many are, but in the sense that their presence carries something, their words carry something, the knowledge of the depths that Jung described, the knowledge that only comes from having descended and returned, radiates from them in ways that help, in ways that reach, in ways that conventional wisdom and textbook psychology simply cannot replicate. Because the person still lost in the darkness of their addiction can feel it when they are in the presence of someone who has been there. They cannot be fooled by sympathy or manipulated by empathy that was never earned. But the wounded healer, the one who carries the real wound, who descends and returned, they know. And that knowing is transmitted in the space between words, in the quality of a silence, in the simple willingness to sit with someone in their worst moment without needing it to be different. This is what God, speaking through the language of your addiction, has been training you to become. The message you were meant to receive. So let us stand here for a moment in the full weight of everything that has been said. Let us not rush past it into resolution or comfort or premature light. You have been chosen, not for an easy life, not for a comfortable faith, not for the shallow water, but for the deep. You were chosen for the kind of transformation that can only happen in the fire. You were given a wound that the world's medicine cannot reach, not because God abandoned you, but because you were being prepared for something that requires exactly the depth of understanding that only this wound can provide. Carl Jung looked at the most broken, most desperate, most written-off people of his era and did not see the lost. He saw the searchers. He saw people whose souls were awake in a way that most people's are not, whose hunger was real in a way that most people's is not, whose spiritual crisis was demanding an answer that the ordinary world was not equipped to give. He saw, in the pattern of addiction, not the random destruction of a life, but the forced beginning of a transformation that should have begun years earlier through gentler means, and would have if gentler means had been sufficient. He saw the shadow rising, the unconscious insisting, the soul refusing to be permanently sedated by a life that was never quite real enough. And he offered, not a cure in the conventional sense, but a map of the descent that is actually an ascent, a map of the darkness that contains the light, a map of the wound that becomes, when finally accepted and integrated, the greatest gift a person can offer to a world full of other wounded people who do not yet know that their wound is not the end of their story. You are not what happened to you in the depths of your addiction, but you are not separate from it either. It is part of you, part of your shadow, part of your wound, part of the unique and specific preparation you have undergone for the life you have not yet fully lived. The God who speaks through your suffering is not punishing you. He is not testing your strength against a standard you can never meet. He is speaking in the only language that could reach past the walls you had built, past the persona you had perfected, past the defenses you had spent a lifetime constructing, directly to the soul inside them, which was always awake, always hungry, always reaching for the real thing it was made for. The addiction was never the destination, it was the door. A brutal door, yes, a costly door, a door that left marks on the frame and damage in the hallway, but a door nonetheless. And on the other side of it is not more darkness. On the other side is the thing your soul has been reaching for since before you had language for it. Jung called it the self. Others call it God. Some call it wholeness, or truth, or home. Whatever you call it, you were made for it. The thirst that drove you to the bottom was pointed at it all along. And now that you have been to the bottom and survived it, now that the fire has done its work, and what remains is what cannot be burned, you are finally, perhaps for the first time, in a position to turn toward it with clear eyes and an open hand and say, I hear you. I am here. I am ready. The conversation God was always trying to have with you can finally begin.